Welcome to the CTA podcast. Join us as we critically examine the ideological capture of the psychotherapy field. Here we discuss better, common humanity proposals for a fairer society. Our discussions are thought-provoking, and our guests are from diverse backgrounds, bringing unique perspectives to the table. This is the CTA podcast with your hosts, Jaco and Christine Siefen. Welcome everybody, welcome back to the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast. And as you know, we have our guest with us, Dr. Lucas Klein. Welcome, Lucas.
Thanks, good to be back.
And it's good to see my co-host, Christine Siefen there. And we're looking forward to our discussion.
Without the background, we're trying something new today with our filming, right? Yes.
So without further ado, how about we jump right in?
Sure.
We're done with chapter 1. How about we go over to chapter 2? Christine, just give us the heading of chapter 2, and how about we dive into it?
Sure. So this is an interesting chapter, and I'm glad that I got to be the one to sort of review it, because it talks a lot about the teaching and the structure of the educational component of this entire movement. And as a former professor, well, I would say I'm still a professor, I'm just not in practice at the moment. I'm especially drawn to this because some of what this chapter talks about, I watched with both my eyes and actually participated in, which I didn't always feel so proud about. And I've mentioned this before in other podcasts, but I was part of the bigger problem, I would say. So here I am redeeming myself to the extent that I can, but talking about what the 5 sort of themes are that they cover in the Holmes Report regarding the educational component. So the first kind of theme 1 is what they call it, is called the ubiquity of systemic and structural racism. You have 2 flimsy, small little paragraphs here that talk about the fact that the systemicness of racism and you know, all of critical social justice issues are all embedded in every system. So of course, what bigger system is there than the education system? So the education system is where they're trying to point out how overly overrun they've become with white supremacy and with privilege, from the teaching to the curriculum to the supervisors and the trainees that are in the training facilities that are working on hours to get licensed, to the candidates that are applying for positions, and that it's only really recognized in the presence. Okay, the systemic racism that's supposed to be very blatantly clear is only recognized in the presence of minoritized Black, Indigenous, or people of color, that BIPOC group that we've been all reduced down to. Those of us who are not white have been reduced down to these 5 letters, BIPOC. Okay, so the point here is that it's not noticeable unless you have somebody of color in the room, which I find kind of fascinating. And the theme 2 is the actual education. So they go into this sort of, you know, kind of breaking down what education looks like, what the training looks like. And it starts with the admissions process. And this is the component here, and recruitment, that I sort of take responsibility for having been a part of this cog of this bigger wheel, because the admissions, directors are very clear with the admissions, counselors and interviewers. And since I was a professor, I did both, about what we're looking for when we are recruiting students. This is a recruiting purpose. Okay, we're out there recruiting. It makes me think of the military. We're recruiting students to come in, and we want to make sure that those students have some of these several, kind of key characteristics. Number 1, they're not white, because we have too many whites as it is. Number 2, we need to make sure that they understand what activism is. They know what social justice is, so that they can go ahead and go out there and be social justice warriors. And number 3 is that if they don't have any concept of this, and no matter what color they are, then we're not going to take them. So we also required an essay that upon admission to explain how you participated in white privilege or how you were the target of white privilege. So this particular section pretty much does the same thing, or talks about the same type of structure of how admissions and faculty influence the program and influence whether or not people are going to come in with a program that's geared towards, dismantling all of the systems of oppression, or whether they're actually viable psychology students. So not looking at what they can bring to the table from a standpoint of being a student and psychologically minded to be able to practice, but from what they bring to it from a standpoint of being able to be an activist. So yes, so the self-perpetuating cycle, they say here, of racism status quo based on cultural affinity remains entrenched in all elements of psychoanalytic training and governance. This includes a Western Eurocentric model of the mind, the individual, the social, and the group that is resistive to cultural norms that include but challenge Western perspectives on the psychosocial development, group phenomenon, the psychic role of community, the Oedipus complex, gender roles, sexualities, and abilities. That is one sentence. So I needed to point that out because of the fact that it is laughable. It is one sentence with a lot of gobbledygook that I can't quite even wrap my mind around, quite frankly. But it is an essential contributor to the racist status quo is in the socioeconomics of analytic training. So now here's a point that they do make, okay, over here, that the racial disparities, and I thought this was, again, this is all junk, but I thought this was sort of a low blow, is that, because psychoanalytic training requires more than just going to school and doing some hours and getting licensed, right? You have a very long road to become a doctor, to receive a doctorate. You have a long road of the amount of hours of psychoanalysis you need to have under your belt. And you have a long road of trying to find enough clients who are able to do this. And so the racial disparities, this is what this report says, in income level are what prevent this minority class, this BIPOC group, from being able to afford to actually get a degree and or license in psychoanalysis. Okay, so the debt, the financial debt and the burden is unfairly placed upon these people who are BIPOC, who don't have access to the resources that the white folks do, who have the money, the time, and are able to get down to the nooks and crannies and finish the training itself and become licensed to practice. So they have a far worse, this is their wording exactly, a far worse debt burden than many, if not most, of the white cohort. So now the financial responsibility is being placed upon the schools to make sure that they can financially afford it and or provide. I'm not sure, because they don't really give me much of a solution here. They pose a problem without much of a solution, but it magnifies, quote, the financial hardship of analytic training for people who are not in an economically sound position upon entering into training. So it's also suggesting that all of the white folks that are there
are equally rich.
Yes, are equally rich.
And all of the other folks are equally poor.
And all of the other folks are equally poor. That's right.
There's the Marxist line, the oppressor-oppressed class dynamics. It's present everywhere and is, pseudo-intellectual nonsense. Most of it.
Yes.
They mix an occasional point in there, but most of it is, as I say, pseudo-intellectual soup. It's quite striking and predictable, of course, that you've got two options upon admission. One is to declare yourself a proponent or, as you say, participant of white supremacy or white privilege, and the other is to declare yourself a victim of it. There's no third option, which is to say I've not had anything to do with either of those.
Yes.
In fact, if you said that, you would implicitly demonstrate your side on white privilege and
yes,
maintaining the status quo.
yes,
right.
Lovely expression that they tend to use all over the place.
The Kafka traps are everywhere throughout this document. It is laughable.
And this systemic racism, that is the ghost that is nowhere and everywhere. It is a thing that you cannot really pin down, but it's got to be there, and you've got to just believe it to be there. And they make of it, they define it however they want to. And it's always the most interesting thing. That gave these researchers carte blanche to interpret all data just according to this systemic racism, ghost doctrine.
Yes.
Look at the title. Ubiquity of systemic and structural racism. Okay, there's some unnecessary, repetitive, superfluous words there. The ubiquity, the widespread presence of; systemic, which means widespread presence of; structural, which means widespread presence of. You don't need to put all of those together. And I wouldn't call these people researchers, Jaco. I'd say they're more pamphleteers. This does not read like a research report. As we've mentioned before, there's no methods section.
There's no methods at all. No. That's right. There's no citation even from where some of these things that are cited, that these BIPOC folks don't have the money to attend. I don't see a citation from any kind of research that was done to show that that's actually the case. I'll just real quick run through theme 3 and 4 and 5, and we can get back to develop those a little bit more if we'd like to do that. So 3 is about the candidate and the faculty experiences. So now we got to take a look at the faculty we hire. That means that BIPOC candidates, okay, according to this report, but also according to the whole mindset of the systemic racism, the BIPOC candidates are going to be more appealing. And they're going to be more appealing because they tend to have experienced more racial microaggressions that are more impactful on them than a racial microaggression would be on a white candidate. So if you had a microaggression against a white candidate, faculty person, they're not going to be nearly as hurt as a BIPOC person would be, which makes absolutely no sense to me, because I can't actually, they don't actually define what that type of microaggression would look like. And I need an example here, because other than having an example, it's just a lot of words on the page.
Oh, the example is, where are you from?
Oh, there's the example.
Dare you ask me
my
where
God,
I'm from?
Slipped my mind.
As we all know, us whites go through microaggression training and resistance from very early on. So we're very robust against it.
We get it through the birth canal, remember?
That's right.
Right. And interestingly enough, they actually call themselves out here by saying the majority of the candidates who participated in the Holmes Commission study experienced racial microaggressions that were not addressed by their institutes, with the primary response as a type of silencing around the incident, directly affecting the morale of the candidates, leading to dropout and a turning away from psychoanalysis as a profession. Where is the actual reference for that piece of data? They're stating very clearly that they know the majority of the candidates who, I don't see any data though that they did. I don't see any kind, I don't see a reference page on this either. Actually, this chapter, out of most of them, I think had the least amount of reference points of the entire report.
One of the glaring problems that shines through this entire report is something that's broadly and insidiously presented by the social justice warrior crowd. They have tried to present what's called a testifying or testimonial epistemology, okay, in the social sciences. And that's why you hear and read segments like what you just read, which is just a testimony of personal experience that is to be believed. So this is what I talk about broadly in my own podcast, which is the radical contextualism, radical subjectivism that is creeping across society. And it's why it's so important to keep your finger on the dial of empiricism and examine the world around you and evidence. And it's precisely why they don't do any of that in this report. Because if they did that, there'd be nothing to write about. The truth is, American psychoanalysis has been bending over backwards to admit any non-white candidate for a long time now. And the truth is, we don't have the resources or the cachet in the public eye at this point to source any candidates at sufficient numbers. I know that there are institutes all around the country that I'm tuned into who are having a very tough time sourcing any candidates to make a sufficient class size. So the idea that you're going to have a perfectly representative, diverse class to match the various communities is absurd.
It's absurd. And, you know, interestingly, what they also like to do is they segue here at after this point of turning people away, they segue into making a comparison that in 1911, the British psychoanalyst Ernest Jones and 7 American physicians were all white men who started the American Psychoanalytic Association. Membership was limited to physicians, and psychoanalysis was characterized as a medical treatment to gain public acceptance. And here we go. Here's the kicker. As the Nazis rose to power in Germany, there was a large backlash in the United States against Jewish refugees, and comparatively few were allowed to immigrate to this country. In this context, so in the context of the Holocaust, World War II, the refugees that came to the country, the analyst refugees fleeing Europe in the 30s and 40s were not welcome at the psychoanalytic institutes, as they were perceived to be heretical competition, and many were non-physicians and or were women. I'd like to see what you two think of that.
Jaco, go ahead.
It's like they can't make up their mind, because just in the previous chapter, one of the previous chapters, they said that right from the beginning, psychoanalysis was regarded, or was tainted by this exclusivism or this racism, and they were referring to Freud and his companions in Austria and in Germany. The one moment they mentioned that this group was themselves racist and exclusionary, and the next moment to say that America was so racist and exclusionary that those who fled the Nazi Third Reich regime, that they suffered under this exclusionary and racist behavior. It's like they can't make up their mind.
They can't make up their mind.
You know, you were talking about, they mentioned the Oedipus complex and how it was formulated, and how they discriminated against certain individuals during the early days. Well, I know who some of those individuals were. They were people like Guattari, Felix Guattari. Him and Deleuze wrote Anti-Oedipus, and there they glorified, wait for it, the perverse structure as the ideal structure, as opposed to the neurotic structure. And do we have to remind people about Wilhelm Reich with his orgone and bionics theories, and how he visited Einstein to get some legitimacy from him, and when Einstein said there were so many things that were wrong with your experiments and your interpretations, suddenly it turned against Einstein and said he was such a bad physicist and scientist. Wilhelm Reich was in prison for 2 years, and he repudiated the Oedipus complex and the neurotic outcome of it, and he wanted children to have free access to sexual behavior, even involving adults. So those were the type of persons those early psychoanalysts were against. They were not very kosher, no pun intended.
Yes,
they were not very kosher. It was not for no reason that they were discriminated against, because they were actually rather dangerous to their patients.
Jaco, you brought up a good point in addition to the one you just made in our last segment, which is that out of all of these schools of psychoanalysis, you find the Lacanians to be most susceptible to radical subjectivism, woke ideology. And I failed to mention in response to what you said there last time, but I'll say it here. That's rather insightful. One of the reasons for that is because, as you might know, the Lacanian version of the unconscious replaces intrapsychic structures in the Freudian model with a simple dispersion of language.
Yes.
So it replaces drives and any kind of internal structure with simply a construction of language. So the unconscious, the mind, is just dispersed by language. And that's the whole French postmodern scheme. Nothing's real, nothing has any veracity to it other than its construction by language. And as we all know, of course, language is just a means that the powerful have to suppress the rest of us minions. And so if we use their words, then we're complicit in the structure that oppresses everyone else. And that's, of course, why you see this unfalsifiable nonsense in this report, this Holmes Commission final report on racism in American psychoanalysis. It's not meant to make sense. And so we sit here, the three of us,
that's what it is. The
merry three here, trying to spelunk through this document, and we sit in awe as to the points they make and the absence of evidence. It's not meant to make sense. Lacan is not meant to make sense. In fact, I trained with someone who himself trained with Lacan, and he mentioned that Lacan took great pleasure in being misunderstood. He dressed to the nines. I mean, the man would dress in a three-piece suit everywhere he went. He was, described in quite narcissistic terms. He loved being so mysterious that no one could understand his writings. And if you open a Lacanian book, it's nonsense. It is complete nonsense because it's not meant to make sense. The Holmes Commission report, they're not as embedded in their own view of their genius as Lacan was, but this is not meant to make sense. It's not a document that beckons the reader to develop a cohesive line of thought about stuff that exists in the world. It's meant to be a language changer. It's just a document that is meant to change the way that your tongue moves, but not the way your eyes perceive the world.
Well, the other thing, there's no winning anyway. There's no way to win. I mean, right here, even if white faculty members acknowledged, okay, there's no way to get around it. Even if white faculty members acknowledge the negative impact of systemic racism, they felt they were equipped to address, and this is according to Holmes Report, to address racism in the classroom and in the curriculum supervision. But the candidates and the BIPOC faculty, in contrast, disagree that white faculty were prepared to address racism, especially when handling classroom discussions on race and systemic racism. So again, I don't see a citation here for that, but the idea being that it doesn't matter how much you try to learn to be a non-racist, no matter what it is, as a white person, as a white faculty member, as a white, candidate in teaching, as a white student, even, you're always going to be ill-equipped to address it. There's never a point at which you can ever win this war.
No, that's right. And later on in the report, they mentioned that a lesser degree of white faculty thought that something like microaggressions or racism was a huge problem in the institutes. A lesser degree of white faculty,
right,
which was, of course, evidence that they were more blind to their own racism. Their report, white faculty's report, that the issues that the Holmes Commission was investigating were not as big of a problem as other non-white faculty were thinking or reporting it was, and candidates were reporting that it was, isn't evidence that maybe they're really perceiving less of a problem.
Yes.
No. It's evidence that they're blind to their own racism.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is a religious text.
It's a religious text. Oh yeah, here we go. The guilt and shame among white faculty members regarding being the initiator of racist or radicalized events with the fear or fantasy of retribution forecloses meaningful dialogue. I don't know, the words guilt and shame popped up and the word religion popped out of what you were saying.
And yeah.
Wow, there it is.
And the data itself, as we've mentioned in the previous segments on this, as can be found in chapter 4, the data is just subjective feelings of, I had an experience of feeling oppressed. That's it. It's not actuarial, it's unfalsifiable.
Yes.
So, and we will see this in the data too, where some of these tables would indicate that there might be some similarity in perceptions between the white folks and the BIPOC folks. And then the interpretation would be, oh, this is interesting. Almost as they say, okay, they're starting to get it. So in that case, we take the opinion of the white folks seriously enough to accurately reflect reality.
Right.
But with other tables, there might be some differences.
Exactly.
And in that case, they would say, oh, this is interesting. So that just shows how blind these white folks are. And we cannot take their perception as an accurate reflection of reality. So either way, this is non-falsifiable. They either use it to confirm or they reinterpret and criticize the situation to confirm the ubiquity of systemic racism, as they said.
That's right. It all folds into the narrative.
Theme number 4, enactments. So the occurrence of racial enactment provokes an immediate reaction for all involved. The reaction to racial enactments depends on where that enactment occurred, whether in group classrooms, group settings, classrooms, scientific meetings, online forums, meetings with candidates and faculty, or didactic settings, interviews, supervision, advisors, or personal analysis. Undergirding the individual and institutional response is the hierarchical white power structure that powerfully and often unconsciously impacts the radicalized encounter, minimally addressing the minoritized subject of the offense. I would like to turn to the two of you to explain to me what they mean by this.
Well, I'm not going to try to, I'm not going to repackage what they're saying into some sort of digestible form. I'm not going to do a Ionian metabolism here and take their unmetabolized fragments and try to synthesize them into something that's digestible.
Yes.
But what I can say here, one of the things that I say often about paranoid ideology on the far right is that it serves the purpose of providing the paranoid person with the fantasy that there is someone in power, that there's someone looking after the structure of things. So, for instance, it's often the case that very, very far right people think George Soros is behind everything in Western civilization. You know, look, another George Soros DA, you know, and that's just, it's taken as gospel. One of the actually comforting fantasies that lies behind paranoid ideology is that it affords the person suffering with that ideology to believe that there is a grand conspirator who has the reins and is actually organizing things, which is actually much more comforting than recognizing the stark reality much of the time, which is that no one's in control, which is that society is always careening towards chaos, and that the structures that organize us communally are very easily undone and often are undone. For instance, I'll get very political here. You know, obviously our president is disintegrating in front of our eyes. He can't talk, he can't walk. It's crazy. There's a lot of people who believe that the Obamas are actually pulling the strings behind the scenes, or the Clintons are. That's most likely not true. Most likely what is actually terrifyingly true is that we have an old person beyond his years who's at the helm. He's simultaneously at the helm and not at the helm. That's very scary to think about. And it's much more comforting to believe that there is a grand conspirator behind the scenes who's actually got control of things. It may not be the kind of control you want. You know, it's sort of scary and terrifying in the paranoid ideology, but it's much more comforting to believe that at least someone sentient is behind the helm and guiding the ship, someone who has an organized view of things, even though you view it to be, you know, undesirable. The same thing crosses my mind listening to this commission report on racism and American psychoanalysis. American psychoanalysis, much like the rest of the world, it's really a shoestring operation. Infantile fantasies abound when we all enter training, meaning when all of us went into training, Jaco, I don't know if you found this, but when I entered training, we have infantile fantasies, like the training analysts are going to fill us with referrals, right? That's of course not the case. The reality is everyone's struggling to make their own ends meet. The reality is there's hardly enough proper analytic patients to go around. The reality is most analytic institutes operate in the red financially. I know this, I've been on the boards of institutes before. The reality is there are some benefactors that might swoop in like an angel investor and keep an institute fluid financially just for a little while longer. That's the reality. This report seeks to establish infantile fantasy as the reality of institutes. And by that, I mean, they think that somehow institutes are flush with cash, that they can bankroll candidates, that they're sitting on a pile of money. They don't seem to understand. All institutes are nonprofits, barely scraping by, barely with an endowment enough to keep their library open. So this report, to me, reads like a paranoid ideology, rather than recognizing the frailty of psychoanalytic institutes, the shoestring operation that has always constituted their organizations. It seeks to present the reader with this idea that there is this rich skull and bones society that, but not for its sinister and privileged and exclusivity mindset, would be offering this sort of Edenic solution for diverse candidates. That's what crosses my mind in response to this report.
I agree with that. And a while ago, I read, what was it, a computer programmer or a gamer's analysis of QAnon. And it was interesting to see how it's almost as if there is a program that does the same thing all the time, and that is just to confirm.
Yeah, right.
And the suspicion is that there is this huge mind who's pulling the strings, like what you just said. And whatever happens must be intentional, and the mind is up to something.
That
all the
too.
time.
Yes.
But that is what we tend to find with large group regressed, narcissistically regressed large groups, where they assume that there is this huge evil mind behind the other group, and that they're responsible for our suffering, and that they have all the resources possible to alleviate our suffering, but that they're withholding it. So there we also see the infantile envy. I feel frustrated. I have the mother who's idealized. Why am I still frustrated? If she doesn't seem to be frustrated as much as I am, I have to enact my destructive aggression upon her, because in this envious process, I perceive her to be the withholder of relief.
Right.
So I much rather destroy her so that neither of us feel relief, and both of us could feel dismal frustration.
Exactly. And that's Kleinian psychoanalysis. No namesake of mine, but for those of you who are studying analysis or interested in those lines of thought, that's what Jaco is referencing. Cutting across all of these theories is evidence. This is why we falsify. This is why we examine the world around us, isn't it?
Yes.
I would like to know answers to basic questions, like how many Black or BIPOC candidates are applying to institutes?
Yes.
Do we know the answer to that?
No, we don't, because it's never mentioned.
So they're talking about diminished numbers. They're talking about racism and exclusivity. Fine, but why not start off by saying this is the number of candidates who applied from one racial group, and this is the number of candidates who applied who are white, and these are the percentages who got in of those who applied. Why don't we have those basic numbers? I will venture a guess. I'll venture a guess that the number who would be admitted from any non-white group is going to be much closer to 100% than the white group.
Yes.
We all know this to be the case. Like I said, American psychoanalysis has been bending over backwards to have diverse classes for a long time now. And so, it works against them to include evidence like that. And it works against them to include actual descriptions, actuarial evidence as to what do you mean a microaggression? What is that? What this person reported that? Well, what actually was that? What does that mean? And is your interpretation of a microaggression some sort of veridical representation of external reality that we're to take as though it's analog evidence? I mean, this is nonsense. But I hope the listeners can understand what we're saying here. This is a paper masquerading as a paper.
Yes. And to end this particular portion, we'll go theme 5, and we have a lovely one paragraph for this section, the personal training analyst. So issues of race were seldom brought up by the analysts within one's personal training analysis, removing race from the psychoanalytic sphere race and racism were not addressed as an intrapsychic phenomenon on the same level of influence and significance as sexuality and aggression. The marginalization, if not absence of race and racism, is an intrapsychic, interpersonal, societal factor affected all candidates, but particularly the BIPOC candidates.
Notice the presentation of race and racism as being of the same importance in analysis as the Freudian drives, sex and aggression.
Yes.
Without even not even an attempt, not even a feigned attempt at explaining why that should be the case.
Right.
It's just, let's completely invert and change the Freudian imperative. It's like, folks, this is psychoanalysis.
I'd be worried and dissatisfied if I were a member of the BIPOC. Well, I am gay, so I suppose I have some, what should I call it, intersectionality points available to me.
You do.
But even still, I would be worried and dissatisfied if I had the suspicion that I was selected to become, to be trained as an analyst because of my orientation, as opposed to because of the type of person I am, the type of defenses I employ, and my insight into my own psychology.
Well, that's it. This is what they don't. This is what they don't understand about the BIPOCs. If I place myself in that group or that category, is that most people, and I'm just making a generalized statement, do not want to be accepted into a program or a school because they needed to up their numbers on the amount of women that were accepted, the amount of people of color that were accepted. They want to be accepted on their merit. And it's actually insulting to think that a BIPOC person can't reach the same level of excellence that is required to be accepted into these institutions, so that the bar has to be lowered for them or exceptions have to be made. And I myself, in that position, doing admissions interviews, know for a fact I admitted people that I didn't think were great, but they fit the 5 points of what we were looking for: social justice, person of color, person who's, gay, and whatever else it was, came from a low income, let's say, socioeconomic status. So I myself have done that. And it's insulting to the person on the other end. And this is why when all this talk goes around about what BIPOC people want and need on many levels, it's not the BIPOCs that are telling you that. It's actually the whites that are telling you that, because they don't have a clue, is my point. So I think that's where I'll end my particular commentary on that. But that's, it's offensive. And even growing up, I did have a good friend of mine who got accepted into a top, let's say, 20 university out here in the States. And she was BIPOC. I'm just going to keep her details very vague. And she got accepted and she didn't go. And she didn't go because she knew that she got accepted due to affirmative action. And the fact that we had, colleagues, other students that had 4.0s, and she barely had a B average and wasn't accepted, and those students were denied. So she didn't go. It was that offensive to her because that was very blaringly clear that that's the reason that had happened.
Yeah. I think any person with a shred of self-respect would be reluctant to just accommodate that and go along with it, knowing that they're actually just lowering the bar for you because of you.
Yes. They don't believe you're going to be able to rise up, that you can meet that. That's why all these merit-based, programs, gifted student type of programs that they have for the high schoolers are getting removed. You have, some gifted program that was removed from one of these big schools over there in New York City a couple of years ago because they found it offensive to the BIPOC community that they didn't think could ever reach the level of being a gifted student. So therefore, everybody else had to sort of be brought down a notch, and they had to, remove any sense of competition or meritocracy or any kind of, healthy competition, that we have to have in order to move forward and succeed and attain in life. Yeah. So everybody gets first prize. Everyone's getting the shiny trophy now.
I think what you're bringing up, Christine, is so important. The true cost of a document like this and of a movement like this in psychoanalysis or in any field is that it fully detracts from solving the real issues at hand. I would love to see representative groups and classes. I would love to see an expansion of Black analysts or BIPOC analysts and so forth. I think that'd be great.
That's not the issue.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's not the issue, right?
But that's an outcome of solving the problem at the ground level, not creating some sort of a theological movement like what we're reading here. And so that's the real travesty of something like the Holmes Commission report, is that it puts a veil over how to solve the actual problem. If in fact psychoanalysis is not able to source Black candidates or BIPOC candidates for one reason or another, it would behoove us and behoove the nation and the field to be able to get at why that's really happening.
Yes.
And to address those matters where they're actually occurring on the grounds of why they're occurring. This report does nothing in that direction whatsoever. So we should understand how many Black candidates are applying. What are their credentials? Are they admitted at lower rates? Is that even something they're claiming in this report? I can't recall. It's something like 400 pages. If they're not making their way through the institutes as fluidly or successfully as they should or that we want them to be, why exactly is that really? What's happening that is really impeding progress? And the idea that it is some sort of a ghost of racism's past that is wafting into the institutes and poisoning select people and ushering them out of the buildings is so much of a fairy tale that it stops us from actually examining the mechanisms that may be at play in a much more complex fashion that could be occluding people from finishing programs. And that's the real travesty of this kind of report.
Well, I think that will wrap it for today. Thank you very much, Christine. That was a great presentation. I think we have much deeper insight into the minds of the people who wrote this report. Well, next time we will go into the nitty-gritty of the surveys and how they interpreted the data, and we will proceed from there. Lucas, thank you very much for your contribution as well. We really appreciate your time, for making yourself available. And I hope in future we can do the same again.
Thank you both for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Yes, thank you.